Hello and welcome back to my channel where we explore the fascinating world of the Bible. Today we're diving into the Book of Leviticus, one of the most important books of the Old Testament. Now I know what you're thinking, Leviticus can be pretty dry and boring, right? Well, today we're going to show you that Leviticus is not only fascinating but also has some really important lessons that are relevant to us today. So without further ado, let's get started. First, let's talk about what Leviticus is all about. Leviticus is the third book of the Hebrew Bible, and it focuses on the laws and rituals of the Israelite religion. It was written by Moses, who was the leader of the Israelites during their journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. The book of Leviticus is a continuation of the story that began in the book of Exodus, which tells the story of the Israelites' escape from slavery in Egypt. Leviticus picks up where Exodus left off and describes the laws and rituals that the Israelites were supposed to follow as they journeyed through the wilderness and settled in the Promised Land. One of the things that makes Leviticus unique is that it is primarily concerned with the worship of God. Leviticus is all about the Israelites' relationship with God and how they were supposed to worship Him. The book describes the various offerings that were required of the Israelites, including burnt offerings, grain offerings, and peace offerings. It also describes the various festivals and holy days that the Israelites were supposed to observe, including the Sabbath, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, you might be wondering why all of these offerings and rituals were necessary. After all, couldn't the Israelites just worship God in their own way? Well, the answer is no. The offerings and rituals were necessary because they were a way for the Israelites to show their devotion to God and to seek His forgiveness for their sins. The Israelites believed that by offering these sacrifices and following these rituals, they could atone for their sins and earn God's favor. So let's take a closer look at some of the key themes and lessons of Leviticus. One of the most important themes of the book is the idea of holiness. The Israelites were called to be a holy people, set apart from the rest of the world. They were supposed to be different, to live in a way that reflected their devotion to God. Leviticus describes the various things that the Israelites were supposed to do in order to be holy, including following the dietary laws and avoiding certain kinds of clothing and jewelry. By following these laws, the Israelites could demonstrate their commitment to God and set themselves apart as His chosen people. Another key theme of Leviticus is the idea of sacrifice. The Israelites were required to offer a variety of sacrifices to God, including burnt offerings, grain offerings, and peace offerings. These sacrifices were a way for the Israelites to atone for their sins and to seek God's forgiveness. But they were also a way for the Israelites to show their gratitude to God and to acknowledge His blessings. Leviticus teaches us that sacrifice is an important part of our relationship with God. It's a way for us to show our devotion to Him and to seek His forgiveness when we fall short. One of the most challenging parts of Leviticus is the section on sexual morality. Leviticus includes a number of laws that prohibit certain sexual practices, including homosexuality and adultery. These laws can be difficult for modern readers to understand, especially given the changing attitudes towards sexuality in our society. However, it's important to remember that these laws were given to the Israelites as a way to help them live holy lives and to set themselves apart from the surrounding cultures, many of which practice sexual immorality. While these laws may be difficult for us to understand today, they remind us that God has a plan for our lives and that He wants us to live in a way that is pleasing to Him. Another important theme of Leviticus is the idea of justice. Leviticus includes a number of laws that deal with issues of justice, including laws about restitution and the treatment of slaves. These laws remind us that God cares about justice and that He wants His people to treat others fairly and with respect. They also remind us that our actions have consequences and that we are responsible for making things right when we have done wrong. Finally, Leviticus reminds us of the importance of obedience. The Israelites were called to obey God's commands even when they didn't fully understand them. This obedience was a way for them to demonstrate their faith in God and their willingness to trust Him. Leviticus teaches us that obedience is an important part of our relationship with God. When we obey His commands, we demonstrate our love and devotion to Him, and we experience the blessings that come from living a life that is pleasing to Him. So what can we learn from Leviticus? First and foremost, we can learn that God is holy and that He wants us to be holy too. We can also learn that sacrifice is an important part of our relationship with God and that it's a way for us to show our devotion to Him and to seek His forgiveness. We can learn that justice is important to God and that He wants us to treat others fairly and with respect. respect. And we can learn that obedience is an important part of our relationship with God, and that it's a way for us to demonstrate our faith and trust in Him. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's all well and good, but how does any of this apply to me today? After all, we don't offer burnt offerings or follow the dietary laws of the Old Testament. So what relevance does Leviticus have for us in the 21st century? Well, the truth is that while some of the specific laws and rituals of Leviticus may not apply to us today, the underlying principles and themes of the book are still very relevant. For example, the idea of holiness is still important for us today. As Christians, we are called to be a holy people, set apart from the world and living in a way that reflects our devotion to God. We are called to avoid sinful behaviors and to pursue a life of righteousness. Likewise, the idea of sacrifice is still important for us today. While we may not offer burnt offerings or grain offerings, we are called to offer ourselves as living sacrifices to God. This means that we are called to live our lives in a way that is pleasing to God, sacrificing our own desires and wants in order to serve Him. The idea of justice is also still important for us today. As Christians, we are called to care for the poor and the marginalized, to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, and to seek to right wrongs and correct injustices in our world. And finally, the idea of obedience is still important for us today. While we are no longer bound by the specific laws of the Old Testament, we are still called to obey God's commands and to live in a way that is pleasing to Him. So there you have it. The book of Leviticus may seem dry and boring at first glance, but it's actually full of important lessons and principles that are still relevant to us today. As we seek to live lives that are pleasing to God,